Good evening and welcome. This is going to be the first of 3 webinars under the title of Jewish Studies Today. I'm Tirosh-Samuelson and I'm Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. To those who are not familiar with the Center for Jewish Studies, let me say that we are a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience through the ages, covering the diverse dimensions of the Jewish experience as it has evolved over time. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and exhibits, Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry about the past and an invitation to be engaged in the study of the present. We believe that knowledge about Jewish culture is critical to flourishing Jewish life in the 21st century and to constructive relations between Jews and non-Jews. Our programs contribute to the quality of Jewish life in metropolitan Phoenix, and they enhance Jewish studies around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has compelled all academic units to offer programs virtually rather than in person. But if you participated in our previous activities during this past year, you know that these online programs are most beneficial to a very large audience. And we will not be able to reach the very same audience if we held those activities in person and on ground. So starting this evening and in the next 2 Tuesdays, namely April 13th and April 20th, we will reflect on the status of Jewish studies today. Let me remind you that Jewish studies as an academic discipline began about 200 years ago. Most people are not aware of it. It started in Germany in the movement called Wissenschaft des Judentums. From the start, the academic study of Judaism was part and parcel of the Jewish struggle for emancipation from legal and economic disabilities, from social marginalization and exclusion, and from periodic violence and persecution. The struggle for emancipation lasted about a century, for formal emancipation, roughly from the French Revolution in 1789 until the unification of Germany in 1870. But it was a very uneven and incomplete process. The emergence of Jewish studies as an academic discipline signified the demand for the inclusion of Jews in society and culture, on the assumption that Jews are not different from non-Jews, and that the Jewish past should be understood with the same academic tools that were applied to any other subject. To study Judaism academically or scientifically meant that the Jewish past must be studied historically and philologically in a disinterested and objective manner. Judaism became a subject of scientific interrogation, and that included the canonic text of Judaism, which Jews have taken to mean that they are divinely revealed, or at least divinely inspired. Thus, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, rabbinic Midrashim were all texts that could now be examined and analyzed with the scientific tools of history and philology. But if so, can these texts be treated as divinely revealed or divinely inspired texts? That was the primary question of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. But today, when we are at the beginning of the 21st century, this question does not drive the academic study of Judaism. Today, different questions take center stage. Why should we care about Jewish studies? To whom does Jewish studies matter? Or how does the academic study of Judaism contribute to Jewish life in the present? So this program will focus on ancient Judaism. Our next program, next Tuesday, will focus on medieval and early modern Judaism. And the last program on April 20th will focus on modern and contemporary developments. For our program this evening, we will focus on the question, what are the new ways that scholars today engage ancient texts, and why do they matter for Jews and non-Jews? We have three panelists. Let me introduce them. Professor Joel Geraboff is actually a very important person in the history of Jewish studies at ASU because he was recruited in 1978 and he created the infrastructure for the study of Judaism at ASU. Professor Geraboff holds a PhD from Brown University, and he was a student of a very known person who contributed greatly to Jewish studies, and that's Professor Jacob Neusner. And Neusner was a towering scholar of ancient Judaism in the 20th century. Professor Geraboff specializes in rabbinic Judaism, as well as in the transformation of the religious life in modernity, especially in America. His studies explicated rabbinic understanding of peace, rabbinic understanding of hatred, legal pluralism, the emotions, and many other complex issues. His analysis of contemporary Jewish life shed light on the interplay between Orthodox Judaism and psychoanalysis, the role of religious studies in the curriculum of the global university, and the relationship between faith communities and civil society. Our second participant, second panelist, is Professor Françoise Mirguet. She is also interested in the intersection of religion and other dimension of life, but she works not so much on rabbinic text, but rather on the Hebrew Bible and its interpretation by Jews and non-Jews, those people who wrote in Greek. So she writes primarily about the Judeo-Hellenistic population and the literature that they left behind. She's a graduate of Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium, and she's the author of, most recently, the book under the title An Early History of Compassion, Emotions and Imagination in Hellenistic Judaism. That came out in 2017. She also has many essays on emotions and on the construction of the self in ancient Jewish text. Her research indicates that to understand ancient Judaism, we must take into consideration the enormous diversity within the Jewish community, as well as the cultural interaction between Jews and non-Jews, be they Romans or Greeks, or of course, the beginning of the early Christian community. She brings to her analysis of the Jewish ancient past a deep familiarity with the literature that Jews read and composed in Greek. Our third speaker or panelist is Professor Timothy Langiel. He works also on the Hebrew Bible and its reception in later centuries, but he goes further back to study the emergence of the biblical canon during the Persian period. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto, and he addresses the question that we posed for this panel most directly. His scholarship shows how the Hebrew Bible informs and shapes modern and contemporary Jewish understanding, or self-understanding, I should say, whether it relates to nationhood or to power or to human embodiment. Professor Langiel's publications engage trauma, memory, and Jewish responses to catastrophe, from Antiquity, namely the Second Temple period, all the way to World War I and even to World War II and the Holocaust. His research explains how Jews have understood the Bible over the centuries and how they applied it to their interpretation of trauma. So our order of presentation will be the reverse of our order of introduction. We will start with Professor Langiel, then Professor Mirguet, and finally Professor Geraboff. They will each speak to about 20 minutes, And then we will begin with some questions. You are welcome to present your question through the Q&A function. And Lisa Kaplan will monitor the Q&A section, or with her help, we'll go through the Q&A section. So I'm going to turn off my video and my audio as well, and we're going to listen to Professor Langille, please.
Thank you for the very generous introduction, and yeah, you introduced me better than I described myself, so I do appreciate that. What I'm going to be doing here today, since we have 20 minutes, what I would like to do, rather than talk about my research first, if I can get to that and talk about reception history and some of the stuff I've been working on in, as Hava said, with World War I and the Holocaust and such. I'll get to that. But what I want to talk about, since it's in the news, is the Shapira Deuteronomy fragments, because I'm going to put in the chat here the New York Times long article on it. And this is much more interesting than me and my research, and I'm not in the New York Times, so we're going to go with this. And this is a news story, so I thought I would take this opportunity to raise some questions and some methodological issues and what the scholarly conversation is at right now, and going back actually 150 years with it, because this isn't the first time the Shapira Deuteronomy fragments have been litigated and relitigated. So I'm going to start with that, and if I have time, I will talk about my own research. So after a century of neglect, Idan Dershowitz has published an article called The Valediction of Moses, New Evidence on the Shapira Fragments. And this has caused a stir. And as you can see, if you've clicked on the link in the New York Times, it's asking if this is a forgery or in fact the oldest biblical text and the oldest copy of Deuteronomy, which is interesting. And Dershowitz is saying that it's offering, quote, new evidence and arguments against the prevailing theory that Wilhelm Moses Shapira forged his famous Deuteronomy fragments. So there was an article recently published on this. Dershowitz has a forthcoming monograph with a full transcription of the what we call Shapira strips. These are actually not a scroll, they're strips, which is kind of unusual, and we'll raise some scholarly questions with that, and translations and copious notes. And what Dershowitz is bringing to the table here, which other people haven't had, are Shapira's actual notebooks, where Shapira's trying to figure out how these fragments go together, which I think, or it's been argued, that would suggest that Shapira himself would not be the forger, because if you're doing a forgery, you would just produce it, right, rather than trying to put it together. But there's a lot of interesting questions, and this will lead us down a path to some methodological questions and how we do biblical studies. So I think this is a great example of Jewish studies today, especially since it was in the New York Times, and this has been, especially for the Bible, like a pretty big story. So Wilhelm Moses Shapira, born 1830 to passed away sadly by suicide in 1884, was an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem who claimed to have had these Deuteronomy fragments written in a Moabite script. And when they date this text to the 10th or 9th century BCE, that century is earlier than where we date Deuteronomy now as biblical scholars, during the reign of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. So this is very early. There's debates about literacy in ancient Israel at that time. The Moabite writing is interesting as well. Another interesting aspect of this text is it's missing the Deuteronomic code, right? It's reduced the law down to the 10 commandments, which is unusual, plus an 11th commandment, which is basically, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, because basically I'm your God, which sounds very Christian in a way. So it's interesting that this is, some people are suggesting that this is the earliest copy of Deuteronomy, and we're down to the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. So what is another issue with this is, so going back to Shapira, he tried to sell these fragments to the British Museum, which caused some issues. He tried to sell them for £1 million. They had done business before, the British Museum in Shapira, but they were cautious because he was closely connected with a forgery, the Moabite forgeries. So this is about 1883 that we're talking, 1873, 1874. There's these Moabite forgeries based on the Mesha stele from inscription from Moab. And these got deemed to be a forgery. And one of his close colleagues, or one of his colleagues, was the one who forged these. So there was some suspicion around this. So when scholars in the museum determined that these in fact were a forgery, Shame Shapira ended up committing suicide months later. The speculation around the shame and the destruction of his reputation, right, scholarly and also as an antiquities dealer. And the fragments got auctioned off, but they perished in a house fire. So we no longer have the actual original manuscript, which causes some issues if you're claiming that this is the oldest copy of a text, if you can't carbon date it or do all the stuff that biblical scholars do to try to date a text. So I don't think there's any way. I'm interested to hear maybe what the other panelists and the audience have to say. If you can claim that something's the oldest text when the text doesn't in fact exist because it got burnt. Furthermore, this is so this definitely caused an issue. We don't have access to the original, and since then, over the last 1.5 centuries, scholars have argued, debated, relitigated this case, and again, Dershowitz is bringing some new evidence to the table, and re-examining the case makes sense, I think, but does it mean it's not a forgery? What does a forgery mean? So, the inquiry into the past, examining a document, we got some issues with that. And interestingly, Shapira claimed, even though he's got 4 different origin stories for how the text came to be, which has caused some suspicion as well, but they were ultimately found by a Bedouin in a cave, which, if anybody's familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's the Dead Sea Scrolls origin stories with Cave 1. Right, and actually the Bedouin found Cave 4 and 11, which are also the richest caves for texts. So this is interesting. And in fact, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, some scholars thought they might be fake because of the Shapira fragments, right? Which raises the question, since we now know the Dead Sea Scrolls are legit, what does this have to say about Shapira's fragments? So, Dershowitz also mentions the recent epigraphy, which is basically the study of inscriptions, which he's relying on that might raise some questions. But again, we don't have the original text. We don't even have good photos of them. We have Shapira's drawing of the text, right? So how do you do epigraphical analysis of that? Professor Christopher Walston from George Washington University, who's a very heavy hitter in this field, did declare, I've got a link to his blog as well if people want to read that quote. Like, he basically says that this work is going to convince very few epigraphers, that he doesn't think that this is going to sway the argument whatsoever. And again, this comes down to not having the original and, having just the drawings of these manuscripts. So, people calling this the oldest text and the oldest copy of Deuteronomy. But again, we don't have this text, and just drawing of something that's purported to be the oldest raises some questions as well. And importantly, Dershowitz has, as I said, Shapira's notebooks, in which, again, Shapira's trying to reconstruct these texts, see how these, again, and these are strips, which is unusual as well. We don't expect to find them in strips. So, this suggests that he's not the forger. And most people do forgery, right, for money. And presumably the Bedouin who sold this text did not make bank either, right? So nobody's really making money off of this. So this raises some interesting questions as well. There's been speculation that these strips were from an old Torah scroll, repurposed, for this text. And another problem is too, going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because these origin stories of finding things in the desert, right? Not only the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Nag Hammadi library, a Bedouin finding something in the desert seems to be a trope. There's speculation too with, at least the Nag Hammadi one, that maybe someone was robbing a grave and then attributed it to digging it up from the ground, but we won't get into that. So a problem is we don't have the provenance of the text, right? We don't know where it comes from, because at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know which caves they came from. We can situate these texts, but we can't do this with these Deuteronomy fragments, because that's the risk you run with it being on the Antiquities market, right? You don't know where it comes from. And that's a big, that's something that's very useful for determining dating of a text. And, and again, you can't, if you've got the drawing of a text, how do you do epigraphical analysis? How do you carbon date this text? How do you find any origins or situate this text, right? So these are some of the methodological issues we are looking at here. Text can be found in caves, rubbish dumps, genizot or geniza, right, which is essentially a storeroom in the back of a synagogue. We found texts in there, but we really can't state what is going on here. Often, as we've found with other forgeries, it often speaks to something exciting during the forger's time, right, the present. So maybe this text could be, if it is a 19th century forgery, it might be telling us something about, 19th century Christianity, perhaps, right? Because Shapiro did convert to Christianity, and that 11th commandment sounds very, very Christian, and also stripping the law down to the 10 commandments. So basically, I don't really, I find this interesting. I find this fascinating, and also, raising the new issues, and especially the notebooks, I think, raise some interesting questions. The relationship with the Dead Sea Scrolls, once again, with, the Bedouin, and this sounding a lot like Shapiro's story, but I really think we're at a loss when the text is destroyed, and that we're basing this on a drawing. So that's basically, how am I doing for time? How much, am I about 20 minutes now, or 15?
Yeah, you've got another 5-10 minutes. That's okay. Go for it.
Okay, maybe I'll talk about my own research, because I think I've covered most of the bases that I wanted to with our interesting story here. So my research, I'll talk about that for a few minutes, what I do and how this ties to issues now. Again, Dr. Tirosh-Samuelson provided a great introduction to what I do. So a lot of my work, I work in memory studies. My dissertation was on memory. I've published on memory, and that's just the way groups of people, communities, societies remember events, right? And I'm especially interested in traumatic events and how memory works with that. But I've started working more with reception history. And for those who don't know, I'll give you a nice little quote from the Bible Odyssey, Brendan Breed's entry on what reception history is. Reception history is the study of how biblical texts have changed over time in different cultures, communities, through transmission, translation, or reading, retelling, reworking. In other words, reception histories explore all the different ways that people have received, appropriated, and used biblical texts throughout history. So some examples of how I use this. First of all, actually, I'm teaching a class for the first time, a 7.5-week one at the end of the third pandemic semester. Not great for professor or student, I'll put it out that. It's a great class, but we're all burnt out and zoomed out. But last week, with the sex aspect, we were looking at religio-sexual racism. And we're looking at how, we're looking at caste, right? Using Isabel Wilkerson's book, and also looking at Hindu caste, and actually looking at the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany in 1935 as a form of caste as well. But, focusing on the American story, the students and I, we looked at biblical prohibitions against mixing, right? Because this goes deep into American racism and American racial laws, right? We looked at some texts from Ezra and Nehemiah prohibiting mixing, the curse of Cain and Ham, especially Ham, seeing Noah naked and being cursed, right? It justified Israel's subjugation of the Canaanites, but then it was used later to enslave Africans and to, with the African diaspora, Black Americans, to justify their enslavement, the racial laws for endogamy, and also the anti-miscegenation laws as well, right? Because we got our first laws against, mixing in marriage and, sex in general between different races in Virginia in 1662. But by the time things get to the Supreme Court, like in Georgia in 1869, the Georgia Supreme Court, miscegenation is not allowed in the eyes of God. That was the Supreme Court ruling, using the Bible. Tennessee said the Hebrew Bible it bans mixing. That was in 1871. The Texas Supreme Court in 1877 said, marriage is God's domain. It's already been ruled on by God in the Bible. No miscegenation, right? So we've been looking at, how the Bible was used to, and especially in this moment in America where we're interrogating, caste racism, structural racism. It was interesting to, look at it with the students, what the Bible does. We also read parts of Rabbi Pinchas Hirschsprung's memoir, The Veil of Tears, which documents his life 1939 through 41 in Dukla, Polish part of Galicia. That's filled with biblical references, right? For him drawing off of tradition, during this moment of Nazi occupation. Some of my other research I've tried to look at is the use of Joshua in settler colonial contexts, especially in North America, the way Joshua was read, to justify, the displacement and eradication of indigenous people. I've looked at how Nazi theologians read the Bible, especially Joshua 6, right? The German Christian movement seeing like, look how awful Jews are in Joshua 6. This justifies, our anti-Semitism, right? And they very much racialized religion as well. So that's been interesting. And I've also, I published an article just this past year, looking at the Jewish Legion, the way Jews, which was an exclusive Jewish fighting unit during World War I, fighting for Britain, how they used Maccabean heroism and imagery in both constructing the muscle Jew, right? And Bar Kokhba is part of this, but also to fight, right? That this was the first exclusive Jewish fighting unit since World War I, since the Maccabees, and this is how they imagined themselves. And I'll be writing on this book this summer. It's J.H. Patterson's With the Judeans in the Palestine Campaign. He was actually, the commander of the Zion Meal Corps, and then the Jewish Legion. And, his writings say, this is awesome. I've always loved reading the Bible. I've always loved Jews. And who knew that reading about Samson and David and Joshua would prepare me to be a commander in World War I, leading this Jewish fighting unit. And he also draws off Maccabees. I've looked at a figure named Rabbi Isaac Lieb Falk as well, who's used Maccabean imagery and biblical imagery in his sermons to Jewish soldiers during World War I. So that's some of the reception history I've been working on, because I'm really interested in how the Bible is received and then used in different contexts, whether it's, using the Maccabees for Zionist masculinity, or, looking at it with students trying to engage, race in America and looking at how the Bible has been used to, justify American racial laws. But I know I'm past my time now, I imagine, so I'm gonna zip it and pass the mic to Dr. Merguez here.
Right, thank you, Tim. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much, Chava, for your introduction. And also thank you all for your presence this evening. So I have a PowerPoint here. So in this short talk, I will present a selection of new methodologies and questions that guide scholars in the study of late antique Jewish communities. And my talk will have 4 points: a new understanding of the label Hellenistic Judaism, a new interest in gender, a new question about some late antique texts, namely, are they Jewish or Christian? And I will end with a new archaeological discovery, the Rukok mosaic. So I start with a new understanding of Hellenistic Judaism. Hellenistic Judaism refers to Greek-speaking Jewish communities, both in the land of Israel and in the diaspora, roughly between the death of Alexander in 323 BCE and the Byzantine period, perhaps up to the 6th century CE. The label Hellenistic Judaism was coined in the 19th century by the German historian Johann Gustav Droysen. It may be misleading, as it evokes the simplistic image of a stable, unchanging Judaism in the momentary, superficial form of Hellenism. Recent research has called for renewed understanding. Eric Groen notes that for many diaspora Jews, and even Palestinian ones, I quote, Hellenic culture was no alien entity to which adjustment was necessary, but a significant part of their own lives, end of quote. Despite a frequent lack of political rights and even persecutions, many Jews understood themselves as Greek, as names suggest. For example, Theodosius, Theophilus, Jason, so all Greek names for people who understood themselves as Jewish. They also understood themselves as citizens of their own city, like Alexandrian or Antiochian. So, for example, the 1st century philosopher Philo of Alexandria is referring to biblical stories, but also to Greek myths, both, it seems, belonging to his own variegated literary tradition. Other scholars, such as Gabriele Boccaccini and Michael Sutlow, invite to understand Jewish history beyond, I quote, static binary encounters, end of quote, where cultures tend to be reified or essentialized. They rather emphasize the diversity of Jewish groups, each with their own fluid and changing modes of engagement with the dominant culture. Most contemporary scholars advocate for a fluid notion of identity, with Jews and other minorities perceived as full participants in the global culture, not so much appropriating practices and ideas, but actively contributing to building intellectual, literary, and artistic traditions. For example, the Jewish philosopher Philo built an innovative philosophical framework combining Middle Platonism and Stoicism, thus reaching beyond the Jewish tradition. The historian Flavius Josephus, relating his own experience as a general in the Judean War, probably wrote the first autobiography in the Western world. So both asserted the intellectual relevance of Jewish traditions, while at the same time making contributions to the larger culture. So this renewed understanding of late antique Jewish communities may be inspiring to reflect on contemporary diaspora Jews whose commitment to Judaism may be expressed in their engagement in the broader society, for example, in promoting democracy, human rights, or the arts. A new interest in the study of late antique Jewish communities is gender. So studies in history have stressed that many concepts organizing human experience are linguistically and culturally constructed. For example, ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek terms translated as pain do not have the same connotations, and they also do not correspond to our modern concept of pain. So Jewish studies scholars have recently devoted attention to the late antique concept of gender, not only the role of women in Jewish communities, but more recently, the way femininity and masculinity are uniquely constructed. So many Greek-speaking Jewish authors presuppose the Greek and Roman model of gender, a model that was not binary, but rather centered on masculinity, itself functioning as a gradient. In this model, male and female bodies can have both masculine and feminine traits, some of which are fixed, are constant, but others are fluid. Suffering, old age, or defeat, for example, can result in a loss of masculinity. So gender tends to function as a spectrum ranging from adult-free men with the highest level of masculinity to less masculine people, including elderly men, boys, slaves, and women at the lowest end. Political discourse also relies on gender. Rome presents itself as a male victor. The emperor represents perfected masculinity, while conquered nations are often feminized. So how do Jewish authors engage this concept of gender? And I will give here two examples, Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus. So Philo refers constantly to femininity and masculinity in his work. Like his Greek and Roman contemporaries, he understands gender as a spectrum ranging from a perfect masculinity to an imperfect and passive femininity. So not a model of feminism, but that is actually not my point tonight. Philo pervasively uses the category of gender to express notions with a similar hierarchical range, including, and that's what I will focus on, his conception of the deity. Divinity for Philo displays a similar scale with a range of more or less divine beings. Like gender, this hierarchy is fluid. A human being, for him, can become closer to divine status. Although Philo resists the deification of the Roman Empire, he grants Moses a quasi-divine status. He calls Moses the God and king of the whole nation, who is said to have entered into the darkness where God was. That's from his work on Moses. So Moses' perfect masculinity makes him quasi-divine. So now let's look at Josephus. So Josephus relies on a similar model of gender, but uses it in a political way, in a constant effort to restore the masculinity of the Jews despite a defeat to the Romans. Material and literary sources attest that post-70 Jews were painfully exposed to the forced feminizations that Rome imposed on its conquered nations. The Judea Capta coins, we have here some examples, represent Judea as crying, prostrate, sometimes bound woman, so on the right side of the coin, while Rome is portrayed by a standing and victorious, fully armed male soldier. Josephus' work responds to this feminization in various ways. As Steve Mason has argued, Josephus attributes to the Roman ideal of the courageous warrior to several male Jewish models, including the Hasmonean rulers, the Essene community, and the Judean troops in general. So masculinity is demonstrated through the control of one's emotions and impulses. Masculinity in Josephus, but also other Judeo-Hellenistic works, can be asserted or even regained through self-restraint. So this text imagine a possibility of remasculinization, not in the political sphere where it was not possible, but through the control of the self. So the inner life is imagined as an alternative realm to restore a compromised masculinity. Philo's and Josephus' uses of gender indicate the impact of cultural constructs. Human beings think with the vocabulary and the concept provided by the language and culture. These concepts, like gender, do condition our perceptions and thinking. The prevalent model of gender informs how Philo conceives of humankind and even the deity, even something so closely connected to his Judaism, the Jewish God, he will still think about it using those concepts from the dominant culture. On the other hand, Josephus' example illustrates resistance that cultural concepts can also afford. Josephus, who intimately experienced the Jews' defeat to the Romans, was captured, employs the dominant model of gender in an effort to reassert his people's dignity and inspire a sense of empowerment. So now a new question in the field about a number of late antique texts extant in Greek. Is this text Jewish or Christian? So many texts, as I said, extant in Greek are unclear about the origin, whether they are Jewish or Christian. For example, the life of Adam and Eve, an anonymous text that tells what happened to Adam and Eve after being expelled from the Garden of Eden, most likely emerged in a Jewish environment, while Christians edited and transmitted the text. Scholars debate whether the current text is still representative of its Jewish core, or whether it should rather be approached as a mainly Christian composition. Robert Kraft and James Davila made a case that the absence of explicitly Christian motifs, like Christ, for example, does not make a text automatically Jewish. They also need to exhibit traits, so they say, shared by many Jewish groups in antiquity, such as worship of the one God, Jewish scriptures, laws and rituals, the temple cult in Jerusalem, and the self-identification as the Jew. The problem, as other scholars have noted, and it's a very current debate, is that several texts well established as Jewish do not exhibit several of those features. For example, the novel Joseph and Asenath, which may in fact be the oldest Western novel, does not mention the temple, the Shabbat, or circumcision, while for another example, the wisdom text attributed to Pseudo-Phosilides makes no claim of being Jewish. So in fact, it may not be possible to decide whether the life of Adam and Eve is Jewish or Christian, or which percentage of Jewishness and which percentage of Christianness. In this regard, Daniel Boyarin and others have convincingly shown that the boundary between Jewish and Christian groups up to the 4th century was notoriously porous, often forcefully enacted, and sometimes inexistent. For example, the prologue of the Gospel of John reads as a typically Jewish midrash, according to Boyarin, while Philo's interpretations about God's word, the Logos, may be more readily placed in a Christian milieu. So now, how is this scholarly debate relevant today? Well, what counts as Jewish or representative of other cultures is not always obvious. The boundaries of identity, as noted in the beginning, are often porous. Creative works, whether intellectual experimentations or artistic productions, are sometimes situated precisely in the margins, in that fuzzy borderland between cultures, as my last example will illustrate. So now I'm going to discuss a new finding, the discovery, the Hukkok synagogue. So the ancient village of Hukkok is situated in the Galilee. You see the little red cross on the map, about 4 miles northwest of the Sea of Galilee. So you see on the image on the right, you can see the lake in the background. The site includes 2 mikvaot, 2 mikveh, and several graves. In 2012, a team led by Jody Magnus excavated the remains of a synagogue. And in 2017, it unearthed magnificent floor mosaics. The synagogue is oriented towards Jerusalem, and it was built in the early 5th century CE. So I'm going to show you now a few examples of those mosaic. So we have first, I'm going to begin by this, an inscription. It's in Aramaic. You can recognize here the word mitzvot or mitzvotechen, so commandments or your commandments. This is probably Yehi, may it be, in Aramaic with an aleph, and an amal, which means labor or toil. It may commemorate, it may incite people to observe commandments. It may also be a way to acknowledge the donations made to the synagogue. One of the fundamental mitzvah in rabbinic times was the practice of alms and donation. So that the full mosaic with that inscription, that same inscription, actually it's really interesting. So we see 3, and there were probably 4 half-naked male bodies, which themselves, with the feet, hold those rondels. And here's a detail of that rondel, which probably represent a mask, a theater mask. They are merely similar representation in ancient Greek arts. And then if you look closer, and that's in green, you see those little naked boys with wings. No doubt, those are little cupids. I would never have thought that I would find cupids in a synagogue. So let's continue with some biblical scenes. Here we see a boat, the sea, fish, and then here on the right, 3 fish eating a human being. So yes, that's Jonah, and it may reflect rabbinic interpretation of the tale where Jonah would have been eaten by 3 fish. So here we have 3 little female bodies with wings and a tail and playing musical instruments. Those are actually identified as harpies, so little sea monsters, which represented the winds in Roman culture. So clearly representing, the storm from the book of Jonah, but with typically with a typically Roman motif. So here we have the Tower of Babel. You see, the people from different ethnicities, different skin color who contribute to building the tower. But we also see a fight, as well as people falling from the tower, and that probably represent God's punishment. This is a representation of the crossing of the Red Sea, with the Egyptians represented as Roman soldiers being eaten. I mean, one at least is being eaten by a big fish. This is a lovely panel. We see all kinds of animals. They are all in pairs. So yes, this is unmistakably a representation of the Ark of Noah. So this is a more puzzling panel. So there are three different levels. Here we have the bottom. It's probably a representation of a bloody battle. Then we have a second level. We have men clothed in white, some with the H. It's in fact on the clothes. The H is in fact the Greek letter eta, which represented in the Roman world higher status. And then we have on top here a scene which opposed, one of those priestly, like probably priestly people to an army whose leader is about to sacrifice a bull. You also see the elephants. One interpretation is that this represents the encounter between the high priest of Jerusalem on the left and Alexander the Great, the fictional narrative. This is unique because this is a non-biblical scene, something quite unique in a synagogue. So finally, this is the central panel of the mosaic. We have central roundel. You can see horses with wheels, see the moon and stars. Then they have smaller roundels around it, each with a human figure, a Hebrew word, and here we have Capricorn, a Scorpio, and Libra with the balance. And the Hebrew word is in fact the name of a month, Tevet, Marishvan, and Tishrei. So yes, this is zodiac, as comparison with zodiac from other synagogues easily attest. This is from Beth Alpha, also in the Galilee. So in the middle was most certainly a representation of the sun god, Elios, here represented with the rays of the sun, on his chariot led by 4 horses. So not only were those mosaics represented human figures, but also possibly the divine. So, and here's a detail of the Libra holding the balance. So the mosaic suggests a thriving Jewish community flourishing under Christian Byzantine rule. The Jonas panel denotes an interest that in fact more common in a Christian context. Christians read the story of Jonah as a prefiguration of the resurrection. So perhaps that panel suggests contacts between Christian and Jewish communities. So Hukkok's congregation obviously loved the arts, was open to and conversant with the outside culture, and also approved of human, perhaps also divine representation, despite the rabbinic prohibition. So I would like to finish with 3 concluding thoughts. So first, while it is a fact that the relationship between Jewish communities and dominant powers, as well as neighboring communities, Christians, most often took the form of a broader and an equal confrontation, recent scholarship also provides examples of a more organic relationship with common interests and mutual enrichment, perhaps even despite these persecutions. Then recent discoveries may also be a source of surprises. I, for one, would never have expected to find cupids in a synagogue. In that sense, they expand our understanding of Judaism and gives us a better sense of Jewish communities' diversity and creativity. And finally, Jewish studies unveil the scope of Jews' contributions to intellectual traditions, to the arts, and to other cultural forms, not only within the strict boundaries of Judaism, but also within the broader human society. Many thanks.
Well, thank you, Francoise. This was fascinating, absolutely astounding, I should say, even. It's gorgeous stuff. And we are going to go now to Professor Gerbov, who is going to actually move us to normative tradition represented by the rabbinic elite, shall we say. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chava, and thank you to my 2 colleagues. If we had time, I could draw lots of connections to things they said. One of the most important developments, I would say, in the study of rabbinic Judaism today is it's situating it within its much broader context of both diverse forms of Judaism from the late Second Temple period, as well as in relationship to the broader Greco-Roman, as well as this Babylonian, Sasanian, Parthian, Iranian context as well. And I will circle back to that in a few minutes. These are indeed very interesting times to look at what's going on in the study of rabbinics and rabbinic texts. The amount of literature that's published, the scholarship that comes out daily is intriguing. The number of journals that exist, including something like the Journal of Ancient Judaism, the Journal for the Study of Judaism in Persian and Roman Greek times, the Journal of Jewish Studies, there are numerous venues in which now to publish one's work related to the study of rabbinics. Not only are there new journals, there are a number of interesting book series, particularly focused on ancient Judaism, including Second Temple work that my colleagues deal with, but also rabbinics. Interestingly, a number of these series actually come out through European publishers. Brill has been in the business for a long time, but places like Moore, Siebeck, and De Gruyter, two German publishers, are extensively involved in the publishing of rabbinic-related materials. That itself is a fascinating development and what it tells about the growth of the world today. The scholars who participate in the study of rabbinics are found in universities throughout the world. And I want to come back to that point in a minute to share a little autobiography here, and then I'll circle back to where things are today. Hard to believe, actually finished my undergraduate studies now 50 years ago this year. I did my undergraduate studies at York University, but simultaneously also attended the undergraduate program at the Jewish Theological Seminary. At JTS, what Jewish Theological Seminary is known. At JTS, I studied with any number of scholars covering all variety of periods in the history of Judaism, from Bible to Hasidism to modern Hebrew literature. But what I found most interesting was my study of rabbinics. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to study Professor Lee Levine, who was at that time had already been ordained as a rabbi, and I'll explain why that's an important fact. Had been ordained as a rabbi, had studied his rabbinic studies in part at JTS, but also simultaneously completed his doctorate at Columbia University under Morton Smith. And Lee taught any number of courses, and because of him, I decided I really wanted to go into the study of early rabbinic Judaism. I asked Lee, where would I go? What program could I attend? And this is in 1971. He said, well, there are only several programs you can really go to that really focus on this. You could either go to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which had a Talmud department. It also had a program in the history of the Jewish people where there were people who studied the history of the Jews. And that's a whole complicated story to sort out why Israeli universities had Talmud departments separate from the history of the Jewish people departments. But it tells you something about the state of the field of rabbinics at the time. You could go to study where I ended up going to Brown to study with Jacob Neusner, and I'll come to that in a moment. He didn't mention I could theoretically have gone to Columbia, I guess, to study with Smith, or I could have gone to Yale or then Penn to Judah Golden. And he said, the other place you could go is you could apply to rabbinic school at JTS. And if they like you in your rabbinic studies, they might admit you to the doctoral program. Those years, JTS wasn't all that serious about its doctoral programs, though particularly Saul Lieberman would train students on occasion. And a number of people, in fact, received their PhDs under him. Now, what's interesting here is that people like Golden or people like Neusner or many of the professors at Hebrew University actually grew up in yeshiva, had studied rabbinic texts from childhood. And the reality was, it was quite difficult to break into the study of rabbinics because no universities really could teach you how to read rabbinic texts. They have their own discourse. While you could learn Aramaic, learning how to parse rabbinic texts, especially Talmud or even Midrashic texts, there really was no preparatory place. And the only place you could do this primarily was to go to a Jewish institution and study in that way. Morton Smith was an exception. He was not Jewish. He was actually a New Testament scholar. He also spent time at the Hebrew University. And Smith turned out to train any number of people, including Neusner, including Levine, Shia Cohen, all of whom were also rabbis at JTS. The world has changed immensely since then. To circle back to the point I wanted to make, the number of scholars involved in the study of rabbinics is probably 300 people who hold academic PhDs in the study of rabbinic Judaism, if not more. That's just a guesstimate. The number of programs who you could train include places like Harvard, Brown, Yale, New York University, University of Chicago, UCLA, and Berkeley. Now, what's interesting, just parenthetically in this regard, some of the leading scholars, including Neusner himself, who did not grow up in yeshiva, and perhaps the other leading scholar of the study of Talmud these days is Daniel Boyarin, to whom Francoise also referred, who's at Cal Berkeley, also did not come from a yeshiva background. And that's a major change. So it's not, although he went to JTS, he's not ordained as a rabbi. But now, beyond people like Morton Smith, there are any number of non-Jews, and not that we pay attention to who's Jewish or not Jewish in the field. The scholarship stands on its own merit, but the field of rabbinics, compared to some other fields in the study of the history of Judaism, was basically dominated by Jews for a long time for the reasons I've noted. That is no longer the case. Today, you have people who train in any number of programs. I forgot to mention Princeton, for example, where Peter Schaefer was for any number of years, who also is not Jewish. And I don't mean to pick on Jewish, non-Jewish, but it's not something I would typically do. But it speaks to the broader reality that the study of rabbinic texts is not done in these contexts so as to answer questions of what Jewish law should be today or what Jewish theology should be today. There are people who write on those topics, no question. But much of the scholarship on the study of Judaism are shaped by the very same kinds of approaches and considerations that Drs. Langiel and Merguez talked about: issues of gender, issues of emotion, issue of collective memory, et cetera, et cetera. These are monumental changes in the field of the study of rabbinics. So that is a quick overview. And I want to circle back a little bit to share with you a couple of recent works that that actually did the work for me in preparing my comments today. One of the things Neusner was famous for was kind of write overviews of the state of the field. Status questiones is the fancy words for that. But he would write these essays. I've always told students, if you enter a new topic, and if you can find the great overview essay, it really helps you get a feel for what's going on in the field. So just within the last 3 years, 2 such works came out, both of which actually speak to the question of current trends in rabbinic studies. And I want to briefly refer to them because they actually make clear some of the points I've made to this time. Christine Hayes, who's at Yale, who also is not Jewish, by the way, just recently published through Abington Press, which is actually a Christian press, which is an interesting development, a work called Classic Essays in Early Rabbinic Culture and History, 2017. And what she did in this volume, she went back through essays starting as early as 1819. I'll refer to this in a minute, the famous essay by Leopold Sunz, etwas über rabbinische Literatur. And my German pronunciation is not all that good. Something about rabbinic literature, the classic essay founding the Wissenschaft des Judentums, to which Dr. Samuelson also referred. And she translated any number of these essays, which also speaks to one of the challenges today, whereas in the past everybody read German. That's not true anymore. Scholars come out, they can't read German. So she decided we have to translate these essays. And she was driven by the question, well, what's the value in them? Is there something still important to note in them? And I can't share with you everything she writes, but I wanted to read a few words from what she said. This is in her introduction. The scholarly study of the rabbinic period has undergone more than one sea change since the early days of the Wissenschaft des Judentums. The discovery of new textual sources, that would include the works from especially the Cairo Geniza, which is from the 8th, 9th to 11th century, has a major trove of rabbinic texts and very relevant to the study of rabbinic literature, even from earlier periods, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls would be another example, as well as a few inscriptions, some like the ones that Francois referred to, but a famous one at the Rehov synagogue, which actually mimics a text from the early rabbinic documents. So she goes on to say, the discovery of new textual sources, the increased availability of critical editions, and I'll come back to the importance of critical edition, which used to be the hallmark of what it meant to do scholarship in rabbinics. That is, you had to go through all the manuscripts and citations, and you created a critical version of a text, which allowed the person looking at it to note the various variants. This mimicked, of course, biblical studies with the famous Biblica Hebraica, and such works were seen as what were necessary to do any work in rabbinics. So she says the increased availability of critical editions, the stunning contributions of archeology, much of which have not so much to do directly with rabbinics, but give us a much fuller picture of the world, of the Jewish world from the 1st through the 7th century, what we think of as the time of early rabbinic Judaism. We now know so much more about what Jews in general may have been living like, what they thought, the kind of synagogues they built, and to what this raised all kinds of questions also. To what degree was rabbinic Judaism really the dominant normative kind of Judaism for most Jews during that period? And so she notes the contributions of archeology, the development and refinement of historical critical methodologies, and this is key, the rejection of both historical positivism and historical idealism. Now, what does that mean? The rejection of historical positivism. Much of the field was driven by the sense for a long time. Yes, texts are often imaginative, but somehow if you learn to analyze it correctly, you will find the historical kernels within it. You can extract from a text something from which we can reconstruct something of the history. What we're going to see in a few minutes is, in fact, it's the actual formulation of the text as we have them, which are part of the actual history. We have to figure out who would have put a text together like that. This is not to say that people aren't interested in figuring out what might have really happened, but there's more to a text than some historical scraps that might be preserved in it. And instead of looking at who put it together in the way they did, and to what degree does the formulation of the text already make it quite difficult to extract any kind of historical accurate information from it. So she notes this collapse of what she calls historical positivism, historical idealism, that would take a while to explain, but this is based on the old Hegelian 19th century models that there are essences to any culture. And if you can reconstruct the essence of what something was, its essential traits, then you really know what Judaism was really like. In some ways, this goes back to what Tim was talking about, still present in the field, the fascination with origins. To what Jonathan G. Smith once wrote a famous essay, it's not enough to study the emergence of the text. What really shapes a culture is the interpretation of those texts over the course of time. And the why people are fascinated with origin is sometimes driven by, I think, a normative issue, some sense that the true what it means to be truly a Jew or truly a Christian. This is true, especially in Christian studies, with the famous question, the historical Jesus, that if we only could figure out who Jesus was, that's really Christianity. Well, scholars in the humanities, all of these developments are of importance. And the fact that a particular tradition may have started somewhere tells us very little necessarily about what that tradition has become over time, especially to the extent to which there's not some kind of organic growth to the tradition. But particularly as people live in specific contexts, the ongoing interaction with their context continues to inform the way in which people come to articulate and understand who they are in relationship to earlier formulations. This is a major change from historical idealism, which sought to try to capture the some sense that rabbinic Judaism is, and if we can only understand the core ideas of rabbinic Judaism, they were perceived as transcendent of time. They float above time and history. In some ways, particularly this gets us maybe to what God may have thought in some way, and that's really what it meant to be a Jew. Well, that has also collapsed as well. And the emergence of comparative approaches, the integration of methods and theories from the humanities, such as Dr. Merguez mentioned, gender studies, intersectional studies, cultural studies, postmodern studies. We could go on here and list the way in which, in some ways, the goal of the Wissenschaft, which was to situate the study of Judaism in the context of the humanities, has come to be in the case of rabbinics. That the kinds of questions that people ask these days, informed by insights from anthropology, and such matters, let's say, as purity and the creation of cultural, a creation of identities of self, negotiation of boundaries with others. These are questions that are asked in the humanities in general, and they're the very same questions that now are found in the study of rabbinic Judaism as well. So we bring to the introduction of questions from across the humanities have utterly transformed the scholarly study of the rabbinic period. I only want to share those words from Hayes's introduction because they really do speak to this monumental changes that have happened in the field of rabbinic studies at this point in time. The other essay to which I want to refer was interesting, also published by Mark Hirschman. Mark Hirschman actually is a graduate, received his PhD and his rabbinic ordination at JTS, but is now, was for many years a professor at the University of Haifa, is now at the Hebrew University in some research capacity. I should note here that the developments, when I mentioned the amazing growth of programs in which one can study things about rabbinics, is also true in Israel. Where no longer is it the case that the Hebrew University in many fields no longer quite dominates. Chava could have something to say about this as she holds her PhD from there. But in certain areas, there are excellent people who are actually asking important questions in rabbinics. For example, Ishai Rosenzvi, who's at Tel Aviv University, people at Ben Gurion University, and of course, Bar Ilan University, which is under Orthodox sponsorship, of course, has extensive interest as well in the study of rabbinics. Hirschman was of the model of become a rabbi and study at JTS. He worked under Saul Lieberman, but his work is focused very much on the issue of Midrash. And he published an essay just this year in a German publication, but his chapters in English, Rabbinic Literature, Major Trends and Current State of the Research. So it's interesting, both of these essays just recently came out. We sought to reflect on where the field is at today. And he says, and I'm just going to read a little bit here. He notes, and this would take too long to explain, but he refers to Ephraim Auerbach's work, on famous work on the sages, concepts and ideas in rabbinic Judaism. Came out initially through Magnus Press on the Chazal, and then was translated into English. And he treats Auerbach's work, who was a yeshiva bacher, who also had extensive training, worked on medieval Jewish texts as well. Hirschman treats Auerbach's work as kind of the culmination of a certain kind of scholarship, where he's trying to reconstruct rabbinic ideas with I would say, minimal attention to the date and of various texts upon which he's drawing. This was typical of the field of rabbinic studies on a popular level, rabbinic Judaism, and you could cite a saying that first appears in a document dated in the 1st century, or next sentence would refer to some idea in a document edited in the 9th century. Since it's all rabbinic Judaism, there's no effort to try to distinguish where and when by whom these ideas were said. This is part of what Neusner was critical of, and part of what's called the Neusnerian turn was about the importance of tracing the history of traditions and the limitations that imposes on creating a synthetic kind of imaginary rabbinic Judaism that never existed in that form at all. In any serious way. He treats Auerbach as kind of the culmination of that trend in rabbinic studies. And he says 6 decisive factors impacted the growth of the field of rabbinics today and have brought us to where we are now. And here's some of the list. It's not quite the same as Hayes' list, but there's a lot of overlap. The literary turn and the attended weakening of positivistic history. That is, rabbinic texts, as all texts, are texts. They have literary traits. They were formulated in a certain way. They were not to be necessarily, virtually nobody, maybe Josephus also has a certain genre of writing and writing a history, that conformed to the norms of Roman or Greco-Roman historical writing when he wrote his work. It's not the kind of work that we write if we're writing history today. History in the past was meant to be didactic. It was apologetic. Now, theoretically, that's not what history is supposed to be today, but that's a more complicated issue as to what degree does history still serve apologetic purposes of telling people what it really means to something and what's really America about, but that's a more complicated topic. But this literary turn, taking seriously the literary nature of text, noting that, for example, different textual traditions of the same document or the same text may reflect different insights, different perspectives. And you just don't sort of peel back and try to get to the text, to the original formulation. You actually should treat each of those formulations in their own right as evidence of someone. So this literary turn. Second, religious studies and the history of religions as approaches to the understanding of rabbinic literature. That would take a long time to explain, but my PhD is in religious studies. And the program at Brown technically was called The History of Religions, Judaism in Late Antiquity. So actually, I wasn't trained specifically in rabbinic Judaism, but I was trained in Judaism in late antiquity, the period that we all work in, Tim, Francois, and I. It depends where you say late antiquity starts and ends, but we'll leave that aside. But clearly, we work in that period. And the issues of religious studies were very much brought to the field of the study of rabbinics. That would take a long time to explain them. I would say in brief, one of the things that's come from religious studies is also what would be known as the anthropological turn, paying attention to human beings, what shapes cultures, what shapes societies, comparative research into those kinds of questions. What do we know about issues of purity, of family dynamics in various cultures, both contiguous with rabbinic times and not? That's another trend. Roman and Iranian studies. Roman studies were there from the start. Saul Lieberman's work was built around the study of Greco-Roman culture, his knowledge, intense, voluminous knowledge by memory of all kinds of Greek and Latin writings. And so when he read a rabbinic source, he said, aha, the key to understanding this source is if you look at this Greek or Roman writing. If you want a very good introduction to Saul Lieberman, Daniel Boyarin in Tablet magazine, just a week ago, started the series on the developments in Talmudic studies. And the first installment, which you can find in Tablet magazine, was on Saul Lieberman and the kind of research he did, who was Boyarin's teacher in his own career. Roman studies, Iranian studies, the growth of the attention to Iranian literature, Zoroastrian literature, or it's called Middle Persian literature, written in Pahlavi. It's true, Neusner had learned Pahlavi also and did a little work in that, but of recently, there are a whole number of scholars, both particularly from Yaakov Elman at Yeshiva University, who passed away just a few years ago, and scholars in Israel have been looking at what can we understand about the development of Jews in this period in rabbinic Judaism by situating it not only in relationship to Greco-Roman, but Iranian studies. The same thing I would add to that, just today I began reading a new book that just came out, and I'll say a few things about it in a minute, Jews and Syriac Christians. The dominant study of Judaism in this period, in rabbinic Judaism, has to be situated in relationship to Western Christianity, to the church fathers who wrote in Greek. Now a number of scholars have begun to look at what is a massive corpus of writings, which was written in a language much closer to what the Jews spoke, that is Syriac, which is another dialect of Aramaic and closely related to Eastern, or what's called Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. And that field has now begun to really flourish as well. He also notes Geniza and Dead Sea studies and databases and digitization. That's a fascinating topic, the broader issue of what we call digital humanities. The ability now, you can go to the Lieberman collection of manuscripts of Talmudic texts, and you can see all at once all the major manuscripts of any rabbinic text. I unfortunately spent a lot of money on photo offsets of them that were put out by Makor in the 1970s, and it's kind of obsolete because you could just go to a website and you could see 8, 9 manuscripts all at once. And these are searchable as well as other websites. This has also revolutionized the field. I just want to return and end with one final comment. And it's the subtitle of this new book I began to read today, Jews and Syriac Christians. Jews and Syriac Christians, intersections across the first millennia. And the key words here, it's not Judaism and Syriac Christianity. It's Jews and Syriac Christians. There's not a thing called Judaism that exists outside of the lives. I mean, there are texts and ideas, but they only become alive through individuals and communities who exist in interactions with others. And it's that repositioning the field from so much the study of a thing, as it were, Judaism, to the lives and ideas and thinking and intersectional interactions among Jews and others in this fascinating world of late antiquity that has come to revolutionize the study of rabbinic Judaism.
Thank you, Professor Gerabov. This was fascinating and actually going to be very useful in framing many of the questions that will concern us for the next two sessions. So I'll just pose one question and then we have one question from the audience. I guess I would like you to reflect, all three panelists, kind of what should be the role of the scholar of antiquity within the Jewish community today? You've showed us the complexity of what it means to engage in the study of antiquities, and you emphasize continuity as well as profound changes. But you kind of left, all three of you, you left the Jewish community in a sense in the you bracketed it. We didn't really talk about it. So could you reflect, especially for the sake of the audience, how can the Jewish scholar of the period, all the way from whatever, 1500 BCE, all the way to, let's say, 7th century CE, what should that person do for Jews today? What kind of contribution that kind of scholar can make? Any takers?
Well, I could start on that question. I'll comment on this slightly different way, and then I'll speak to the issue. I recently completed a study of local Jewish historical societies in America. I do work also in American Judaism. This is part of a book I'm co-authoring with another person. And the study looks at the growth of what we call the professionalization of the study of American Judaism that took place in the 1940s. Hasia Diner, who is one of the most major scholars of the study of Jews in America, has written reflectively on the tension she feels between what she calls serving two masters. And she notes she wants to be part of a university. She's a professor of history at New York University. And in that capacity, in the study of history of America, says it's important to understand the history of the Jews. And of course, her study of the history of Jews of America is also important to the study of Jews in the modern world. That's who she really identifies with as the scholar. At the same time, and she noted this in the period after the 2076, not 2076, what was it, the 350th anniversary of American Jews, which was in the early part of the century. And she said, I was invited to speak to any number of synagogues and a number of places. And of course, Jewish studies is supported by donors who have their own interests. And she said, I'm not uninterested. I am a Jew. I identify with the Jewish community, but sometimes I feel like I'm serving two masters. This is an interesting tension, right? To what degree do scholars of Judaism also have something to contribute to and feel and should be contributing to the state of Jewish life today? I think there are various answers to that. I think some people feel a very strong urge to do so. I speak, as many do here, to Bali Beit Midrash, which is a Jewish organization. I think personally, I mean, the challenge is, and I put it brief, Judaism is a lot messier than the simple formulations that people often grow up with. But it's messier because it's formulated and it reflects the lives of real people. And I think personally that if people can grapple with the question of why would people have thought like this? What was the impact of responding in certain ways to their context? That could provide a mirror for Jews today to think about their situation. And while I think it's easy to overstate some of the similarities to the Hellenistic world and today, I think they're very different. There are certain similarities and this diversity to the extent to which people now look at the Jewish world of antiquity as not dominated initially by rabbinic Judaism, but much more complex. For some people, that provides a basis for recognizing we're not the first people who've had to confront the realities of diversity. We're not the first people today who had to struggle with the interactions or celebrate the opportunity of interactions with other peoples of the world. And I think that's an interesting contribution that if a Jewish scholar of rabbinics, for example, can bring to a conversation with Jews today.
Great, that's an excellent comment, something for all of us to think about. Would the other two panelists like to join?
I'm thinking, some of the stuff we've done at the JCC that we can do things thematically, right? Diaspora, right? We can follow these, we can raise questions in ancient diaspora to, think about American Judaism and diaspora now, colonial context, post-colonial context, and then some of the stuff I'm working on, with Zionism. It's pretty hard to understand Zionism without understanding the Second Temple period with the references to Masada, Bar Kokhba, Maccabees, right? Yael Zerubbabel's work, right, with the making of the Israeli national tradition. Like these stories and these texts have lives and afterlives, and they've been interpreted and reinterpreted and have shaped, contemporary politics and identity. Think about Israel, the names of things like shekels and, the way, like the language from antiquity has carried on into modern Israeli, society. And I'm always excited reading modern texts or what, I'm a few years ago, first time watching Black Klansman, the film, the Spike Lee, Jordan Peele film, and hearing the Pirkei Avot quoted in it. And that's the stuff that always excites me. I find it very relevant to the contemporary world and Jewish identities and such.
Thank you. We're going to hear from Professor Mirguet, and then we're going to go to Mr. Paul Fieldstone. Go ahead, Françoise.
Yeah, well, I can only echo what my two colleagues have just said. I would say the role of the Jewish studies scholar in the community, it's just the role of any scholar, basically to question, to reframe, and to broaden the perspective. So as Dr. Garibov said, a scholar of Jewish studies is also there to show the complexity of things. Perhaps the long duration, he or she is also there to give a sense of perspective, of the historical perspective, which I think it's also really important. May also have a role of defamiliarization to show that what we take for granted today may not have been such in the past. And that can range from traditions that, seems to have been always there among Jewish people, among Judaism, but maybe, in fact, just may emerge at a certain point in history. Or concepts that seem universal, but in fact, as I try to do with gender, but deeply historically, culturally constructed. I think the role of the scholar is also to contextualize what the media report, and I think that what Dr. Lengyel did tonight is an example of that. We may have all read about this, those Shapira's fragment, but having the contextualization by a scholar, I think is invaluable. And also something that I would say, maybe also a sense of discovery, of amazement, of, opening eyes to things that are different, that may inspire us. So to what, to what is different and unexpected.
Yeah, that's excellent response. Mr. Fieldstone, please go ahead.
Well, what happened with me a few months ago, I stumbled on the Oriental Institute in Chicago. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And the astonishing amount of archaeology they've done in the Near East. It's astonishing what they've discovered. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of people. That institute started in the 1920s. And a very famous guy, Finkelstein in Israel, he's an archaeologist. He did a lot of digging, and it looks like the Tanakh story was put together afterwards, and amazing stuff comes up. Like that the Egyptian colonization for 200 years, it's not even mentioned in Tanakh. The destruction of Jericho didn't happen the way it says in Tanakh because there's no destruction layer that relates to that period. And then he mentioned about the late Bronze Age collapse, and that's when we emerged as the Highlanders in the highland of Judea and Samaria. So it's just fascinating. How are we going to reconcile this? Because biblical archaeology doesn't go to the Bible anymore. It digs. And then he says, when you get to about the 9th and 8th century BC, they start to parallel each other very closely. But the Northern Kingdom developed before Jerusalem. So it's just sort of amazing. So how are we going to reconcile it? Because they're going to keep discovering more stuff because the science of archaeology has phenomenally improved, including using satellites to be able to discover stuff you can't find on the ground.
Yeah. Okay, Professor Langille, please answer that, and then maybe Professor Mirguet can respond.
Okay. Yeah, with the Northern Kingdoms, most of the Bible's written in Jerusalem, so we have a Jerusalem perspective, and there's some animosity with the North, right? It's bigger, more populous. And what you're saying too about the Egyptian colonization, right? That raises questions about, the Exodus that, if you read Finkelstein's work with, even had they escaped from, even if we can historically reconstruct this and they get out of Egypt, well, there'd be Egyptian garrisons all the way through into the Levant, right? Because Egypt had, colonized that. And so what I do with my students, we look at some of this archaeological stuff, but we look at the social function of the text, right? Like, why tell the story the way it is? Like, we can't find archaeological evidence of the Exodus story, but it's a very important story. In fact, it was just celebrated last week, right? That this is a living tradition. And other question, like if the Israelites even came from outside the land, archaeology showing that Israelites were Canaanites, so that even coming from outside the land, but we have a meta-narrative that starts from Genesis being expelled from the garden, and then Abraham coming from outside the land, inside the land, down to Egypt, back in, then you get the double exiles of the north and the south, and then, the book, it ends with Chronicles, right? Where the 2 Chronicles 36, where there's an exile and a return. Right, so it's a meta narrative, this exile and return, and the relationship to the land of. As Professor Garaboff was talking about, the linguistic turn, right, looking at the narrative rather, because ancients represented the past differently than we do. Like they weren't thinking, history as it actually happened, and these texts had social functions, and we have to think about where it was written, the Jerusalem perspectives, and I'll leave it at that. And I'm also going to pop in the chat box all the units for the Society of Biblical Literature to give people an idea of how the Bible's studied in all the different ways. You'll be scrolling through it forever. The number of units we have and approaches to the Bible is really quite fascinating. And I will turn it over to Dr. Mirguet.
I actually have nothing to add. I mean, this was, I think you said everything that I wanted to say. This was really good. So.
But can I just chime in then, just very quickly here? For years, I've actually taught the course in Hebrew Bible at ASU, and I continue to teach it. And I always had a unit on, beyond reading the text, I always had a unit in which I introduced the archaeological data to try to figure out how do you bring the literary data from the biblical text and the archaeological data together. There's also a question, I think, in a Jewish context, you could ask of rabbinic students or any other, how do you cope with these two data? And interestingly, I used for many years Finkelstein's book, The Bible on Earth, which advanced some of the arguments you made. I would also share here very quickly that despite when I first came to ASU, it used to be about ASU versus U of A, and somehow we were two radically different institutions. The Jewish studies programs between the two universities have always had very wonderful relationships. And at the University of Arizona, for many years, was another very prominent archaeologist, William Deaver. And Deaver came up to ASU. He also spoke in the Jewish community. Deaver wrote a book several years ago, which I switched to from the Finkelstein book, called The Lives of Ordinary Israelites in the 7th Century. And he said, let's try to figure out what these people are about. I don't want to give a whole lecture on Deaver here. Deaver challenged the whole notion of biblical archaeology. He said the goal is to reconstruct the lives of people in the Syro-Palestinian region, and the field of biblioarchaeology should not be the way it's defined. He didn't quite win that battle in some ways, and it speaks to an ongoing tension. If you're interested, his magnum opus came out a few years ago, and it's somewhat problematic, which is a history of Israel based primarily on the archaeological data with biblical sources introduced along the way. So the points you mentioned have actually been the issues confronting the study of biblical text since especially the 19th century, and the emergence of the documentary hypothesis, and all kinds of other issues which decentered for some religious communities have had to cope with a new way of understanding the Bible. And it equally gave rise to what we think of as fundamentalism, which is a rejection of any of this historical critical approach and seeking to still validate somehow the text as being infallible, et cetera. And these are tensions within the world today. I would only add here, last point, one of the interesting things going on in America today is, and President Biden is a good example of that, is that there are liberal forms of Christianity, and more not so much conservative form defines what it means to be a religious. And for too long in America, when people thought of whether it's Jews or Christians, they think of the real religion as the most conservative form. But there are Jews and Christians who have found ways to affirm their Jewish and Christian identity, the normative or the sacred nature of the Bible, and yet take into account all the kinds of developments that you noted. And the challenge, and maybe that's part of what we do, although we don't get in so much into contemporary theology, but it's inevitable given our students, is to help them understand there are people who take seriously religious faith at some level and also take seriously historical, critical, anthropological approaches to the texts themselves.
So yes, thank you so much. This has been fascinating and a really truly enlightening panel. Is one of the comments in the chat noted, use that word enlightening. That's exactly what we wanted to happen, namely Jewish studies is something that really matters to not just to the scholars who engage in it, but to everybody else. I would say to the Jewish community at large. And I think that what we can learn from this conversation this evening is that, as Professor Mirgay said, it's all about discovery. It's about fascination with the past. It's about the fact that we really don't know all that there is to know, and we will continue to engage in it as a lifelong activity. And as long as we stay in a relationship with the past, whether it's through the text or through the facts or through the archaeological remnants, we are standing in that relationship, but that relationship is always based on both reception, as Professor Lagile said, as well as interpretation. So we can't get out of this process of interpretation, but that's what makes our life so rich and so interesting and so meaningful. So with that statement, let me end this wonderful session this evening and invite you all to join us again next Tuesday, April 13. I and Professor Stanley Mervis will talk about the medieval and the early modern periods. My comments will be primarily on intellectual activities, especially on Kabbalah and the Jewish mystical tradition, and he will focus more on social, economic, and political dimensions of Jewish life in the medieval and early modern periods. So thank you all for joining us. And if you still have time to enjoy the evening, please do. And we hope to see you all next Tuesday. Good night.
Good night.